Good evening, everyone. I am Brooke Clement. I am the director of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library Museum and the acting director of the Barack Obama Presidential Library, both of which are part of the National Archives and Records Administration. And it is my pleasure to welcome you tonight. I'm very excited about this one. As always, a big thank you to our partners at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation. And before we begin, I do want to ask you all to just please be sure that your phones are on silent or off. And now, it is my pleasure to welcome tonight's guest, Dr. David Pilgrim. Dr. Pilgrim, Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion at Ferris State University, is one of this country's leading experts on issues relating to multiculturalism, diversity, and race relations. He has been interviewed by National Public Radio, Time Magazine, the British Broadcasting Corporation, and dozens of newspapers, including the New York Times, Washington Post, Boston Globe, Chicago Tribune, and the Los Angeles Times. Dr. Pilgrim is best known as the founder and curator of the Jim Crow Museum, an 11,000-piece collection of racist artifacts located at Ferris State University in Big Rapids, Michigan. The museum uses objects of intolerance to teach tolerance. And Dr. Pilgrim's writings are used by scholars, students, and civil rights workers to better understand historical and contemporary expressions of racism. Dr. Pilgrim is an applied sociologist with a doctorate from Ohio State University. He believes that racism can be objectively studied and creatively assailed. Dr. Pilgrim believes that Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. was right when he said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." Diversity is more than a black-white issue, more indeed than a racial issue. Dr. Pilgrim challenges audiences to think deeply about diversity and race relations. He is a Ferris State University distinguished teacher. He has spent his adult life using objects of intolerance to teach tolerance, and it works. His goal is to get people talking about diversity and race relations in meaningful ways, and then to go and do something positive. And we welcome him tonight.
Thank you so much. Thanks for that kind introduction. I was just sitting there thinking, it's so weird to be speaking this close to my home, because I live in Rockford. So usually, there we go. Usually, I go someplace, if I say something people don't like, I just get on an airplane. And so now I can't get on an airplane, I have to get on 131. So thanks for coming out, thanks for the invitation. See, got a lot of people here from Ferris, a lot of friends, co-workers. My administrative assistant is here, who came all the way up from Florida, which is amazing. What a wonderful job you have that you can work from Florida, right? No, she took a vacation. I know my friend, the provost at Ferris, Bobby Fleshman, is here, which is good. Dr. Pink, the president of Ferris, could not be here, but he's a strong supporter of the museum and the work we're doing. And so I want to give him a shout out to let you know that he's here in spirit. So let's get started. They told me I only have 3 hours, so I want to make sure that, hey, a smart group, they're getting all my stuff. Trust me, this talk will be shorter than it seems. So most of you read Letter from Birmingham Jail, and when I was a kid, 17 years old, and I read it, I wasn't really reading it. It was just a class assignment. If you go on the internet now, there are so many memes that just take something that Dr. King said in that wonderful letter, but they never take this one. And so, like a boil that must be opened with all of its ugliness to the natural medicines of air and light, injustice must be exposed to the light of human conscience before it can be cured. That speaks to what we try to do at the Jim Crow Museum. We take something that's ugly, that was meant, or things that were ugly, that were meant to mock and belittle, and we flip them and turn them into tools for education. I want to give you a warning. I was giving warnings before I even knew what a trigger warning was, because it just seemed respectful. So I'll say a couple things. One, I have like 20 different types of presentations. When I was working on this one, I removed a couple of images. I left an image in there that I really struggled with. I'll talk to you about that. But for the most part, I removed a lot of those images. And I took the same approach that we take in the museum, which is we use the images that we need to use to tell the stories that we want to tell. But having said that, there still might be something in here that is offensive. Who are we? Well, as I said before, we use objects of intolerance as teaching tools. I like to lead with this. We are an anti-racism facility. And it's weird that you actually have to say that out loud now. But I understand, though, if you have a name like we have, which is the Jim Crow Museum, you would, of course, you would create certain thoughts in people's heads. So right off the start, I want to say we're an anti-racism facility. It's also not an accident that we're located at a university. We're not a standalone facility. So we have all the resources that you would have at a university. Let me tell you about a little wrestling that I did. For years, I would not have a single object in the museum that was positive, not one. And it's not because I didn't believe in the power of positive objects. It's because America already had African American studies museums. Not enough, but it had some. It already had African American achievement museums. Good ones. Not enough, but it had some. But it did not have a museum that focused primarily, if not exclusively, on racism. And I felt that adding other objects would dilute our message. And I went to a conference in New Orleans, and it's New Orleans, by the way. If you say New Orleans, you should be ashamed of yourself. That's not the correct, anyway. So I was in New Orleans, and I was at a conference, the National Conference of Race and Ethnicity, and my colleagues there, my African-American colleagues, were saying, listen, we get it, but you're only telling a part of the story. You have to show how African-Americans use their activism and their achievement in real time to push back. Otherwise, you're not telling the story. In other words, you're doing the same thing they do at African-American museums. You're just making the flip mistake, which is I can go to an African-American Studies museum, and in some of them, I don't know what they were resisting. In other words, they don't show any of the stuff that's in our facility. And I thought about it, and I wrestled with it, and man, I tell you what, it's good to wrestle with people, because it would have been a huge mistake to stay that path. When we build a new museum, and I'll talk about it in a bit, but when we build that place, at each point in this country's past, we're going to show how African Americans push back with their activism, with their achievements, but also just living lives of dignity. So we believe in the triumph of dialogue. You know, sometimes people will say to me, you know, we just do too much talking. Words mean nothing. And the irony of that, of course, is they won't shut up. The fact is that we all believe in the power of words, but what they're trying to say is that we need to do more than just talk. Well, in our facility, we want to get people talking in an intelligent way. So I bought my first piece when I was 11 or 12 years old. I broke it. I am so glad I broke that piece, because that is a much better story than had I not broken it, right? It wasn't a philosophical statement. It wasn't, I just didn't like it. I don't remember the second piece or the third piece or the fourth piece, but I just remember collecting my whole life. Look at that handsome devil. I donated more than 3,000 pieces to the university. I have my children here, Jamie's here, Gabrielle's here. So now I have to watch what I say, because I want to make sure I'm not lying. And if I do say something wrong, just keep it to yourself and talk on the way home. And Peggy's here. But I remember one of my kids, I had stuff in the basement. I think it was Haley, who broke something downstairs. And she was a little girl and really upset. And she said, "Daddy, I hurt one of your dolls." And it was a Klansman on a mannequin. And I thought, I got to get this out of my house, okay? And so I donated my collection to Ferris State University. So proud of Ferris State. Not every university in this country would be courageous enough to build a Jim Crow museum or allow one to be built there. So you don't have to know much about teaching. You don't have to study teaching pedagogy to know that there's learning going on in that room. The university gave me 500 square feet. I mean, that's not a lot. It was basically visual storage, and I would bring in my students because I knew the power of an object as a teaching tool. And I would bring in my students, and Ferris State University has the reputation of being eyes-on, hands-on in its teaching. But when you say that, you think of welding, or you think of printing technology, or some of those fields. But that's the way I was teaching race relations. That's the way I was teaching my course in American minorities. I was letting them touch the pieces, and I was asking simple questions like, what is it you see? What does this mean? What are the consequences of millions of pieces like this being created? So we take everyday objects, millions of everyday objects. Someone introduced me the other day and they said that we have 20,000 pieces. No, we have over 30,000 pieces. I wrote an article one time which became the first chapter of a book, and it was called, I referred to myself as the garbage man. My thesis in that article was objects like this belong either in a garbage can or they belong in a teaching environment. So the interesting thing about this picture, which I had not noticed, is I'm talking. Now that's hardly surprising, but if you notice, I'm trying to make a point. But what are the visitors? These are, I'm guessing these are like high school students. What are they doing? They're not even letting me finish my point. They're all doing what? Yeah, see, that's what we need to be done in this country, right? I mean, they had questions. They wanted, what about this? What about that? It was like teaching. I don't know if you've ever taught like first graders. I've had the joyful experience of once or twice in my life reading books to very young children, and they don't obey any of the rules in the classroom. And they just talk when you're talking. They ask you about your socks. They ask you about why do you sit funny. I mean, in other words, it's very engaging, and that's the same thing going on there. So I'll ask you a real quick question. We're not going to turn this into a classroom here, but what is it you see when you see this? First of all, what is it? Where in society would this be? What? Yeah, no, I don't mean like where geographically. I mean like, it's a license plate in Texas, so you're both right, okay? So, yeah, it's a license plate. So when I was growing up, I always thought propaganda was like grainy old film, or leaflets falling from the sky like during Vietnam, or, I had this really narrow definition of what propaganda meant. That's propaganda, right? It's an everyday object that is shaping the attitudes that people have toward black people. In this particular case, if we went back to the 1960s, there was a lot of talk about the new Negro and the new Democrat. And what this says is that the new Negro, represented by Martin Luther King, and the new Democrat, represented by Lyndon Baines Johnson, that they're just rats, right? That's propaganda. I am so glad that I lived long enough in this country that I would live long enough to see that we got to a place where the politics is civil, where it's respectful, where we don't demonize others. You know, we're that city upon the hill now. So every object in the Jim Crow Museum is still being made. Every object in the Jim Crow Museum is still being sold. Sometimes someone will say to me, we can get rid of these objects if you personally stop buying them. I'm not the market. We receive, again, objects every day from around the country. And I'll tell you this, if there is a race-based incident that occurs in this country and it receives national attention, there are 2- and 3-dimensional objects produced within a week. I'm not one of these guys on TV that says things so they can bring you back on TV. That's an observable fact that we document. I don't know if you know who this is. That's me. That's Professor Gates, who came to the museum. So I like to put this here because when the museum was just an idea in my head, I got in the habit of saying, one day, people are going to come from all over the world to the metropolis of Big Rapids. They're going to come by boat, plane, train. Some are going to sojourn. They're going to walk all the way to Big Rapids. And we're going to have people in the classrooms of Harvard wondering what are they doing in Big Rapids, Michigan at the Ferris State University. And then Henry Louis Gates, Skip Gates, come. And he's become a friend of the museum, a friend of, I guess, a personal friend. And I think he referred to us as the most significant historical facility in the country. I know I'm on tape, so I'm not going to say what I was going to say. I was going to say, if you really want to help us, Brother Gates, let's write a check, because we're trying to raise money for a new museum. I'm hoping he's giggling as he's hearing that comment in Massachusetts. So what have we learned? The United States, and I want to make sure we don't get it twisted, we are more democratic and more egalitarian than we were in the past. The last 8 years or so, I think we've taken a step or two backward. But if you compare us to where we as a nation were in the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s, by any measurable, objective measure, we're doing better. But we still live in the residue of Jim Crow. Someone sent me this the other day, and of course I'm an obsessive collector, so my first thought was, if that wall is still up there, at least is here, she can validate this. I said, if that wall is still up there, somebody needs to go to Detroit and get that wall so we can put it in the new Jim Crow Museum. And they're like, do you realize how big that is? I'm like, do you realize what year this is? This is 2024. You can't have walls like this, right? And anyway, the reason I include this slide is because I grew up in Alabama. I was born in Harlem, but I grew up from a toddler in Mobile, Alabama, which is the deep South. And when people think of Jim Crow, when they think of the laws, the customs, when they think of the racial hierarchy, they think of Alabama. They think of Biloxi, Mississippi, and Pensacola, Florida, and Hattiesburg. I'm running out of cities here. They think of, Little Rock, Arkansas. But they don't think of the North, and that's a mistake. And one of the things we're going to do in the next facility is we're going to talk about the history of civil rights, Jim Crow, and the people who fought against it in the North, including in Michigan. So here's something I have to remind myself of all the time. When I walk through the Jim Crow Museum, I'm seeing an object for the 1,000th time, or the 10,000th time. But someone else walking in is seeing it for the first time. And when they see it, it is intermeshed with the racial ideas that they have. I mean, we all have racial ideas, right? Now, we do have some advantages in the museum. I'll tell you what one of our biggest advantages is. When I talk to someone about race in the Jim Crow Museum, they expect the conversation. When I talk to them about race at the water fountain or the ballpark, they may not be ready for that conversation, even though a lot of conversations occur in those spaces. So we have this huge advantage that people come prepared. They expect to talk about it. They expect to, right? Oh, here's a lesson. I tell you what, if you are an educator and you get nothing else from my presentation, take this with you. You cannot crush people. Because if you crush them, you can't teach them afterward. And not only can you not teach them, you can't teach anyone who witnessed you crushing them. That does not mean you don't push back. It does not mean you don't engage vigorously. That's different. That's dialogue. That's what higher ed should be. I mean, the best conversations I should have should be in a higher ed classroom, not a nightclub. I wish those great conversations occurred in churches and in corporate boardrooms. I wish they occurred throughout our society, but they certainly should occur in a higher ed classroom, don't you think? And if they occur in there, I have to be mature enough as a teacher where I don't have to be so right that I crush an 18-year-old or a 30-year-old. When we crush people, we receive a momentary cathartic relief. Oh, that felt good. I look on the internet, I could name for you right now 20 people who've gotten rich and famous traveling around the country crushing 18, 19-year-olds. If I can't intellectually crush an 18 or 19-year-old, what the blank was I doing in higher ed for all these years? It's not a fair fight. Do you understand what I'm saying? Yeah. Don't crush people. Push them. Engage them. Listen to them. And the rightness of their argument should be enough. Man, that sounds like some trite, mawkish foolishness from the 1950s these days. Right? Oh, here's a harder lesson. So someone says, didn't we fix this whole race thing 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 15 years ago? Why are we still having this conversation? The trick is not to stop talking about these things, is to talk about them better. I mean, can you imagine someone saying, why are we still talking about men and women? Didn't we fix that 40 years ago? A mature nation has mature conversations and then takes responsible actions. This is sort of a corollary to something I said earlier when someone would say to me, if you just stop going around the country talking about race, racism will go away. And that doesn't even make stupid sense. Because people are going to talk about race. They're going to talk about sex. They're going to talk about gender identity. They're going to talk about class. They're going to talk about all these things. But they don't want to talk about them in spaces where their ideas can be challenged. So here's a quote from me. It's not especially profound. Americans like happy history, narratives that make us look smart, brave, and exceptional. We want a history that has been cherry-picked and ignores our mistreatment of the weak and disfavored. A history that can be celebrated at picnics, parades, and smug conversations. This approach to history is neither honest nor mature. It's just not. I mean, imagine if, I'm just trying to think of, someone name a subject they struggled with in high school. Algebra. Okay. It makes me feel bad every time I go to algebra class, so I'm not going to go. I'll just stick with addition and subtraction. Like chemistry, physics, I was a horrible student. The idea that we look back at our nation's past and only talk about those parts that we can celebrate, it is remarkably immature. Now, Peg and I moved to Grand Rapids, this area, I guess it was about 30 years ago. One of the best decisions we ever made, by the way. I don't say that because you're all from Grand Rapids. That was one of the best decisions we made. Of course, we were moving from Indiana, so I just lost half the Indiana group with that comment. Okay, I'll move on. So by the time we got here, this business did not exist right off 131. So if you're driving down 131 and you get off on the 28th Street exit, and you take a right-hand turn, it's that first little plaza-type area in there. Yeah. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. I'll take it farther than that. I have a lot of respect for George Santayana, but I think sometimes we remember the past, and we're not better off because the past we're remembering didn't happen. You get where I'm going, brother? The past we're trying to remember is not actually what happened. The purpose of studying the past is to document what happened, not to make us feel good or bad. We want to avoid living in the residue. I mean, there are so many wonderful things that occurred in this country's past. I mean, absolutely mind-boggling, wonderful. And then there's the other stuff. So this is some of the residue that we live in. Incarcerations rates, I don't even want to get, I'm trying not to be overtly political, but I will say this right here. Look at these two images. I'll tell you two quick things. That piece right there, that T-shirt, that was not created during the Jim Crow period. That was created in 2012. One of the most powerful parts of the current museum that we have are contemporary objects. And that would be one of the powerful parts of the next place, right? And then it's over here. The story I'll tell you here, this was at Burley Park. How many of you heard of Burley Park? They do it's a huge flea market at Burley Park. And I went out there. So the reason I put this slide in there is I have bought some of the most awful things over the last 40 years. I don't have to buy much now because people send us stuff. But I traveled this country, cities big and small, buying things that sometimes made me cry in my car. I'm not trying to be melodramatic. I'm trying to let you know what was going on in my car. But I bought them. And almost without exception, I was able to purchase the thing without incident. Almost. There was a time in Colorado Springs in 1994, just before the O.J. Simpson trial, I went into a place and I bought some old 78s, the records, and they had awful names on them. And I guess the person selling them to me saw my face and said, well, I don't know what you're so upset about. This is your people's history. And so he and I had a discussion in a rather dramatic way about how his word choice didn't match my mood. And my takeaway from that day was all I got was an argument. I didn't even get the pieces. You understand what I'm saying? My emotions, because I'm not a robot, my emotions got the best of me. I got the argument and not the pieces. Why am I telling you this story? Because at Burley Park, I couldn't even give that guy $20 for that piece. It's not the most heinous thing I've seen. We have images of people being mutilated. We have children who are caricatured. We have, some of you have been to the Jim Crow Museum, you know what I'm talking about. We have pieces that most people would assume are much worse than those yard signs. But I could not make myself give him $20 for one of those signs. This is the slide that I wrestled with whether or not to include. Now, we have much worse images of objects that defame and mock President Obama in our museum. We have them and it gives me an opportunity to say to people, it's okay to disagree with politicians, philosophers, preachers, or anything else that starts with a P. It's okay to disagree with folks, but we don't have to do this. Again, I told you that material objects, I'm not talking popular culture here, and I'm talking about material culture, that material objects, 2- and 3-dimensional objects are created whenever there's a race-based incident that receives national attention in this country. But the popular culture is also impacted. The behaviors in our culture that you see which follow some of these incidents look a lot like this. So, yeah, I grew up in Alabama, as I said earlier. If you grew up in Alabama as I did, which was, right at the ending of Jim Crow, Martin Luther King would have been someone you likely would have admired. And I remember, being in my 5th grade class at Bessie Fonville Elementary School, and the teacher coming in with a little black and white TV, sitting it in front of us. We didn't understand the gravity of what was going on. We knew what a funeral was. We knew something special had happened. We knew Dr. King was dead. And we saw the horse-drawn carriages, and I'll never forget that day. The teacher said, it was the 4th grade, the teacher said, and now it's your turn. And what she meant is that it's not sufficient enough for my generation of black and brown people to just go and be successful, to just become vice presidents of something or principals or whatever, that there is a part of this deal, this agreement, that now we have to work to move the society farther. I don't think one kid in that classroom understood that. I know I didn't, but I do now. So why do I mention that here? Because Dr. King is famous for this saying that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And without thinking about it, I think I just always thought that was true. I just always assumed that our nation and our world would always be moving forward toward becoming more just. That it was just bent that way. And that even when the progress was so small that it was imperceptible, it was still happening. That we were still moving there. And I'll tell you what, this last 8-10 years, I have heard rhetoric that I heard when I was a child growing up in Alabama, when George Wallace was governor. And I thought we had moved away from that. I put this slide in here because I got a letter from a white graduate student who wrote me and said, I want to study the civil rights movement. I want to study the freedom riders, but I'm white, so I don't know if I can study it. And I felt sick to my stomach. Our history is all of our history. Just do it right, damn it. Did I just say that word on can you edit that out or something? Just do it right. So when I hear people like, why do we have to have black history? We don't have to have that. Why do we have to have red history and yellow history and LGBT? Why do we have to have all these histories? If we did history right, we wouldn't have to do that. And on the flip side, I hope that there is not a single white American who thinks that they can't, and certainly if they have the passion, that they shouldn't help do the work that we're doing. someone gave us all those pictures, the originals of those. They donated them to the museum. And they're all over the internet by the time we got them, so obviously copyrights mean nothing at this point, but we own, so when you look in those books, we own those pictures. So what would I do better? So the first work, whether you're in a museum, a corporation, a church, a school, or a neighborhood, the first work is with the person in your mirror. And we all have work to do. We all have work to do. I belong to a community. I belong to multiple communities. I need to be better. I challenge all of us to be better and to start with that guy right there. This one's hard. I don't think we've lived at a time, certainly in my lifetime, I don't think there's been a time when more people wanted to be right. And if you allow me to say this, when more wrong people want to be right. And very few people just listen, just shut up and listen. And listen to understand. Doesn't mean you have to agree. I can listen to people without agreeing with what they say, but I don't have to demonize them. So here's me kissing the sky. We're going to build a new Jim Crow museum. And it's not the reason I'm here, but I wouldn't be myself if I didn't tell you that we're recruiting champions for this project. And if you can help us in any way, spread the word. If you believe in the work we're doing, spread the word. If you're troubled by the work we're doing, give me 20 minutes, and then after that, go spread the word. That's going to be at the front of the campus at Ferris State University. Isn't that amazing? This is not at the University of Michigan. Well, why would it be there? I mean, I could see it at Ohio State, but I mean, why would it be there? I made it a long time before I did that. I almost made it to the end. We are going to build a place where people come from all over the world, because they already do. We have police departments, city commissioners, church groups, civil rights groups. We had two church groups. I think one was from, what's it, Strongville? Is that what it's called? And one's Cleveland. And they're right close to each other. And it speaks volumes when I tell you that one church was a white church and one church was a black church. But they wanted to have a better relationship. And so they came to the museum so that we could do what we do, which is to facilitate discussions between people. We're going to do more of that. We've had people come from Australia. We have people come from all over the world because folk are looking for a way to do it better. These are just some images from inside the new place. The thing I really like is, and I made this promise to people, we are going to highlight folk that other people haven't heard of. I don't mean any disrespect to Reverend King or Malcolm X or Fannie Lou Hamer or I guess I should have said Minister Malcolm since I said Reverend Malcolm. We're going to highlight people from Grand Rapids. I went to a Giants event and I'm looking through there, it's like, oh, some of these people did amazing things. We're going to make sure that people 100 years from now remember them. So in that reflection space, we're not just going to talk about activism and achievement and where we, and all of that. We're going to ask the big questions. What do I need to do as an individual? What do we need to do as a community? What does the state of Michigan do? And what does the nation need to do? So we have a traveling exhibit, which is now at Wayne County Community College. How many of you saw it when it was across the street over at Yeah, so good. Thank you for coming out. I say this at the risk of sounding immodest, but I think it's well done. I think it's actually a traveling museum, not a traveling exhibit. And the reports I get from everybody who goes in there is, this is done in an intelligent, thoughtful way. And so it's going to be there for, I don't know, next several months. It's called Overcoming Hateful Things. So I don't have much in common, almost done. I don't have much in common with H. Ross Perot. I giggle every time I say that. I mean, we both talk a lot. But I love this quote. I don't like the fact that it's gendered. I wish he had just said a person. But the spirit behind what he says, it just resonates so much for me. Because we pay people a lot of money to come into our communities and to tell us that the river is dirty. We already knew the river was dirty. You did not help us getting off the airplane doing that. We know the river is dirty. The question is, what are we going to do to clean the river? So I want to show you one little thing. When I was younger, I used to travel around with a bag. And like some people have a bag of goodies, I used to call it baddies. But this would be similar to what would be in my bag. So I went to Jarvis Christian College before I went to Ohio State. Jarvis Christian College is a historically black Disciples of Christ school, shaped a lot about me and who I am. And I had a teacher named Dr. O.C. Nix. And I think it was a political science class, but one day he came in and he had something like this and he set it on the table. And he said, "What does this have to do with Jim Crow?" And so we gave the answers you would expect us to give, that during the Jim Crow period, America had a race-segregated job economy, and African Americans were, in this case men, were relegated to positions like porter, chauffeur, just try to think, carpenters, some of these positions. And he was like, "No, that's not the right answer." And it's like, yeah, of course that's the right answer. It's like, no, that's not the right answer. So we took turns just saying the same thing over and over again. And then he said something so profound, and it taught me the value of objects as teaching tools. He said, if you were an African American in the 1930s teaching in rural Texas, that feels autobiographical, by the way, because that would have been his case, or feels biographical. He says, if you were an African American teaching in the 1930s, you weren't paid, if you taught at a school like Jarvis, you weren't paid what you were paid at Texas Christian University or at the University of Texas, but you still had some money. And you also had desires. You wanted nice clothes, right? And you wanted a nice home. And you may have wanted a nice car. But if you were riding around, if your black self was riding around rural Texas in a nice car in the 1930s, you put your life in danger. And so, if you had a chauffeur's cap, you just kept it right on the seat. So if someone stopped you and said, "Why do you have that car? Why are you in this car?" What you could say to them is, "This is not my car. This is not my car. I know my role in society. I know the script. I accept the societal script. I know who I am. I am no threat to you." And I thought, oh my goodness, if he could use a piece which is not racial on its surface to teach such a powerful lesson about the everyday lives of people who lived during Jim Crow, then how much more should I be able to do it with all the pieces that I was collecting? So that's how I started using the object. And then the last thing I have for you is this. So I was debating about whether or not to say this, but I will. So last January, I was in the ICU. This is the pull your heartstrings part of the program. And my takeaway was, A, if there's something wrong with you, go to the doctor. Okay, there's that. So I didn't go to the doctor, and almost waited too long. And probably the night when everything was going to come to pass, finally decided I have to go to the hospital. And so I went to the hospital, and I was admitted almost immediately into the ICU. So why am I sharing that story with you? Here's the thing. We get one life. Just one life. I did a lot of thinking. As a matter of fact, I did a lot of thinking, I did a lot of praying, and I did a lot of promising. I made more promises than a mega church of Pentecostals could keep in 100 years. The promises I made to God were just, listen, I wasn't talking to you, so you don't need to know, but I was making a lot of promises. And I kept almost all of them for about a week, right? But when I think about that time, because when you get farther removed from it, sometimes you lose the lessons that occur. And the lesson that I got in all of this was, this life is a mist. It's a vapor. It's a blessed vapor. And I believe that one of the reasons that I've gotten to continue this time in this mist, in this vapor, is because there's still work that I need to be a part of. And I believe that all of us can participate in the work of making this country a fairer, more just place. I'm not talking about arguing with people. I'm not talking about, you do have to do some of that, but I'm talking about committing yourself. And this is my commitment, and I thank you that you gave me some time to share my commitment with you. Thank you. So I don't know if we had time for a few questions or not, and I know that so if you feel like you have to go, then please do that. But if you want to stay, I'll have a little time. Go ahead. And I only take hard questions. Oh, I got to be back here? Okay.
Okay, I guess I get the first question. I'll preface this by saying context matters. A lot of the images you showed were quite disturbing. But let's go back to the image of the brick wall in Detroit, of the tire company. Personally, I did not find that to be an offensive image.
Okay.
It just looks to me like a cartoon person who happens to be dark-skinned. And that kind of gets to my question, is like, is that an offensive image, especially on Grand Boulevard in Detroit, where the clientele may be primarily African-American? On the one hand, I can see where maybe somebody could be offended by that. On the other hand, I could also see the point of view that, well, should we just eliminate images of black people from society? Well, that's a problem too. Do you see where I'm going here? I did not really find that to be an offensive image. If it had been a white person or a Native American or whatever, I don't think I would have felt much differently about it. Yes. So I'm wondering where the line is, and context certainly matters. You know, where it's located, under what circumstances matters.
Are you done?
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
I'm finished.
No, I want to make sure you're done.
Yeah.
All right. So I think the fact that it does not offend you, okay. What we do in the museum is we take images, and oftentimes, not usually with something as caricatured as that, but sometimes with something like mammy images, we get a similar kind of conversation going. The value of the museum is that we put people in the same space where they can talk about and listen. So whereas something may not offend you, are you willing to understand how it might offend someone else? Because if you're willing to hear how it might, if we open up and allow ourselves to hear that person's story, then we've made progress, okay? You can still have your opinion, right? I think that, so I'm gonna do the mammy thing instead of that image. And then if you want me to, I'll get back to that. But you said something about context matters. Absolutely it matters, okay? Also, remember when I said we bring our own experiences in. And so you have not had the experience of being caricatured as a member of an inferior race. That matters, okay? Now, we don't have to live there, but we also have to acknowledge that that's a real thing. And so us just listening to one another. The last piece of what I got from you was about where it is physically in the society. So that's one of the most consistent things about me is, if I'm looking at racial caricatures, I want to know the origins. I want to know the supply and the demand. I want to know who buys it or who whatever. But it doesn't stop me from recognizing whether it's produced by black people or white people or red people or whatever, the result can still be that it plays upon a historical stereotype. So it doesn't matter that it's in a black area. As a matter of fact, from my point of view, I think that's even more problematic, that the fact that it's in an African-American community. But I don't want us, and this is something I've tried to work on in myself, I don't want to ever get to a point in my life where I tell other people what should offend them. Because there's an arrogance in that none of us have earned. None of us, not one of us. There's 300 plus million of us in this country. There's 8 billion of us in the world. Not one of us has earned and can earn the right to tell other people what should offend them. What we can say is whether or not it offends us. But I'm not going to tell someone else what should offend them. But I want to listen to the both of them talk and hope that at least when they finish the conversation, this is not Saul on the road to Damascus where lightning is going to strike and 3 days later we're going to be different people. But we can listen to one another.
Did that image offend you?
Yes. Yes. But it doesn't have to offend me to be in the museum. The objects in the museum don't even, quote, have to be racist. And by the way, I did want to mention, I don't, see, we go, well, I don't know where the line is. Stop looking for lines. I'm not looking for this is okay, this is not okay, whatever. What I'm looking for is like the conversations, the processing of what this means to you. So in the museum, we use something called visual thinking strategies. And what we say is, when you look at this, what is it you see? Now, I don't tell folks what I see because when I start talking, I can't stop. And then that kills the conversation. But when I'm trying to be a facilitator, I'm asking people, what is it you see? And why is it you believe you see that? So I did a presentation at Western Michigan. After a presentation, it was not a presentation, it was a workshop. And we had like 12, 15 people. They were all art students. 10 of them presented as whites. I don't know, what their racial identification would be. And 2 of us didn't. And my colleague there, Khalid El-Hakim, he had some pieces in his car. And I said to him, can you go get a doll out? Because I want to use it as a starting point for a conversation. We passed that doll around the room, and all we said is, don't interrupt people, don't argue with folks, just tell us what you see. It was, I wish we had videotaped this, it was the most amazing thing. It's like we live in the same country, but a different world. Because again, we bring our ideas about race or sex or gender identity or class, we bring that with us, we take that with us. And that's what we know. And most of us have long since given up on the idea that that we might change. Sorry for that long-winded answer. Glad we got a chance for a couple more. And that was a hard question, so good, thank you. That was good.
Thank you. Are you having conversations, can you tell me if you're having conversations about the nation's upcoming 250th and the commemoration surrounding that?
We have not been having those conversations. Quite frankly, we've been focusing on other, Ferris is having 140 years coming up. We have some other, that'll be something we will, that'll be something we will do.
Easy question.
Easy in a sense that I now feel like it's something we should have been doing already, so, thank you for doing that to me. Yeah, there's a lot of work to be done. Yes, sir.
I'll just yell a question. One of the big controversies in the United States today is the issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that's your position at Ferris, which is great.
Okay.
I live in an area where they just threw out the county office to work on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Is Ferris getting pressure to end programs such as that?
Well, that's a great question. I would hope I would know if we were, because I'm not retired yet, and I have a couple of people in here who actually are direct reports, so they want to know the answer to that question. I'm concerned that almost any discussion regarding group relations, whether it's about race or sex, whatever, is so politicized now that you almost can't have any discussions, right? Michigan, I used to joke with Peggy, I said, we both moved from red states, and we moved to a blue state, which then became a red state, which then became velvet or something, in the state. So right now, let me tell you what I'm not going to do. Let's start there. I'm not going to change the name of our office because of political pressure. But I'm also always going to focus on the work that's done. So I hear people saying, oh, you should call your office now the Office of Belonging, or the Office of Community, or the Office of whatever. So this is how long I've been doing this work. I remember when we used to talk about desegregation. And then I remember talking about pluralism. And then I remember talking about multiculturalism. And then I'll skip up a little bit, and then it was diversity. And then it's inclusion. And then it's equity. And I actually, as a sociologist, am fascinated with the shape-shifting of words that occur, all of that, but it's the work that matters. It's the absolute work that matters. And I don't care what you call it. Are you telling me you're not supportive of us creating a campus environment where everyone feels that they are welcome there, that it belongs to them as much as it belongs to everyone else? Our founder, Woodbridge Ferris, our founder, our first class of students before 1900, our first class of students had women in it. We had students from other nations within 10 years at Ferris. We had African Americans come to Ferris because they couldn't go to college in Virginia. Between 1910 and 1920, between 1910 and the mid-1920s, we had 70 African Americans come up from Hampton, Virginia, because they couldn't take the college work they needed in Virginia. But because Woodbridge Ferris was friends with Booker T. Washington and respected W.B. Du Bois, they were welcome at Ferris, and they changed this nation. I'll stand right here and tell you that John Fitzgerald Kennedy would not have become president had Belford Lawson and I forget Belford Lawson's, I forget his wife's name. Oh my goodness. Had the Lawsons not embraced his candidacy and turned the tide so that African Americans would vote for JFK. He went to Ferris. He was the first African American to win a Supreme Court case. He went to Ferris. Okay? So that's our heritage. Now, we got away from it, but that's our heritage. And I mean, I'd like to think if Woodbridge Ferris walked through that, well, that would be scary, but if through some Star Trek miracle he was able to come here, then he'd be proud of the work that we're doing, because he was doing DEI stuff before it was a name. He took care of those students. He bought them a house out of his own pocket. I mean, the first residential hall at Ferris was in effect the home that he bought for those students because he couldn't find places for them to stay. So we've been doing that work for many, many, many years, and I'm not going to back down from that work. I'm not going to, and if my point about the pluralism, multicultural thing, if we change the name, whatever name we come up with, like the new thing now is belonging. Mark my word, we'll have an anti-belonging movement in this country in the next 5 years. People will be anti-belonging. Did you hear what I just said? They will be anti-belonging. So it's the work that matters. I'm not saying words don't matter, but ultimately it's the work that matters. So we haven't gotten it. As a matter of fact, I'm very pleased that in terms of the museum, some of our biggest, we've had supporters from both aisles, and not just both aisles, the extremes of both aisles. And I don't think they were doing it for the wrong reasons. I think they did it because they came to the museum, they sat down, they watched the movies, they had the conversations, and they were fundamentally good people, and they want to do a good thing. All right, one more. But yeah, I'm thinking about Florida now. So I grew up in Alabama. I'm not even sure I could teach sociology in Florida now. Now, I was the Michigan sociologist, I'm not bragging, I'm just saying, I was the Michigan sociologist of the year 2 years ago, which, by the way, is really scary for this state because I haven't been in a classroom in a long time. So I don't know what the other sociologists are doing in this state, but they need to step up their game. But I don't think I would be sociologist of the year in Florida, you know? And here's the other part. Is there any knowledge, just do the mental exercise, is there any knowledge that should put fear in people? Are you kidding me? Is there any substantive body of knowledge that should put fear in people? I don't think it should. So I tell you, I gave you that quote from Dr. King. This will be the last thing, and then I'll let us go. I gave you that quote about the arc of the universe, you know, and I told you about how that just made me sit down and think, man, was I wrong all these years? Was just some naive person? And then after the murder of George Floyd, I looked on our streets. I'm not talking about folks out misbehaving. I'm talking about in the traditions that I come out of, where people are protesting. I mean, I looked at black people and white people and people from all groups, and these were young folks. And it just re-energized me. Because the message that I got from listening to them was, as we say down south, they ain't having it. They ain't having it. They demand that we be better as a nation. They are demanding it. And I tell you what, that really invigorated me. Because I'm nearing the end of my journey. And you want to believe that there will always be people fighting for a just society. This has been really wonderful. So, you know, you're standing over there like I'm at the Apollo Theater, and you're going to do the little Stand over here to say, let's give Pilgrim a hand.
Okay, I agreed with everything he said until he got to that comment about Michigan, my Wolverines. You're really brave to do that. We changed the upholstery for you.
I appreciate that. So, no, listen, we had a good 15 years. And this last 3 years, if they lose again, I'm leaving.
There you go, we'll invite you back next year. Okay. You know, you use objects to start necessary conversations. We use objects at this museum to do that, and also to express gratitude. And we'd like very much to express our gratitude to you.
Thank you.
Dr. Pilgrim, for just a great presentation.
Thank you, I appreciate that. And I probably, thank you so much. I also want to say this, though. This, for me, I did this as a labor of love, right? So I'm not making any money from this. No, I'm saying, because I do charge some people sometimes.
Might be a gold brick.
No. And trust me, there's no gold brick in here. My point is that this has meant much to me because this is my community, right? This is my community, and I want to give something to my community. So that's what this was all about. So in case those of you sitting there wondering about that kind of stuff, this is me wanting to do something good in the community. And I thank you for giving me the opportunity to do it.
Thank you very much. You did good tonight.
Thank you.
You know, the teacher in me wants to respond just to a couple of things that were said. I have to say, first of all, that I want to thank you for challenging us, Dr. Pilgrim, but also for giving us hope, like a real sense of hope. I also want to thank you. I'm a professional historian, and I want to thank you for reminding us of what good history looks like. The good historian, the professional historian, should be able to go after all the evidence that's available without fear or favor and follow that evidence wherever it leads. That's what good historians do. I also appreciated the fact that you said, you want to reform? Start by looking in the mirror. Start by looking at that guy. I really appreciate that. And since it is Holy Week for many of us in here, that's a great place to start in humility. I also found it interesting. I often say in my role as executive director of this foundation that I'm on a civilizational mission, that there is integrity at the helm that's literally written into the walls of this museum that Brooke and Morell and others curate so powerfully. You're on a civilizational mission too. So brother, I'm really glad that we're on that together. So thank you very much. Good night.